There are moments in life when we are faced with the unknown, when we find ourselves wandering in darkness, unsure of the road ahead. And it is during those times that we must come to grips with an undeniable truth. God knows when. He knows the moments that are coming, the shifts in the seasons of our lives. He knows when the breakthrough will come. He knows when healing will manifest. He knows when the doors will open. He knows when the waiting will be over and we will finally see the fruits of our labor. But as human beings, we struggle with waiting. We are a generation that wants answers now. We want to know how the story ends before we even begin the journey. But there is something powerful that happens when we learn to trust in God's timing. His timing is not our timing. His ways are higher than our ways. And although we might not understand why certain things are happening in our lives right now, we must have the faith to believe that God is working behind the scenes, orchestrating a beautiful masterpiece in His perfect timing. When we are in the midst of struggle, it's easy to question God. It's easy to wonder why we are facing the challenges we are facing. We ask, why me? Or when will this end? But there is a deeper truth that we must hold on to. God is sovereign, and He sees the end from the beginning. He has a plan for us that is far greater than anything we could ever imagine. And although it may not always make sense to us, we must trust that He knows what He is doing. There is a story in the Bible that reminds us of this truth. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but for years it seemed like that promise would never come to pass. Sarah, his wife, was barren and they had no children. They had waited for so long that they had lost hope. But God, in His perfect timing, made a way where there seemed to be no way. At the age of 100, Abraham became a father, and Sarah, who had been barren for so long, gave birth to Isaac, the promised son. But here's what we need to understand about this story. The promise didn't come on Abraham and Sarah's timetable. It didn't happen when they wanted it to happen. It happened when God said it would happen. And when it happened, it was better than they could have ever imagined. It was a testimony to the faithfulness of God and His ability to do the impossible. You see, God doesn't operate on our timeline. He operates on His own. And His timing is always perfect. When we are in the midst of waiting, it can feel like nothing is happening. It can feel like we are stuck in a season of silence. And we wonder if God is even listening to our prayers. But I want to encourage you today, just because you can't see it doesn't mean God isn't working. Just because you can't hear it doesn't mean God isn't moving. There is a process that is taking place behind the scenes that you cannot yet see. God is preparing something for you, and He is waiting for the right moment to release it into your life. Sometimes we think that we are waiting on God, but in reality, God is waiting on us. He is waiting for us to trust Him, to surrender our plans, to let go of our desire to control the situation. God is waiting for us to acknowledge that His way is better than our way, that His timing is better than our timing. And when we finally come to that place of surrender, when we finally release our expectations and allow God to have His way, that is when we see His power move in our lives. We must also remember that God doesn't just know the when, but He also knows the why. There are times when we go through difficult situations and we have no idea why it's happening. We can't understand why we are facing the things we are facing, but the truth is, God is using those moments to refine us, to shape us, and to prepare us for what's ahead. The pain you are experiencing today is not in vain. The struggle you are going through is not meaningless. God is using it to develop something in you that will be needed for the next season of your life. It's all part of His perfect plan. Think about the story of Joseph. Joseph's life was filled with trials and hardships. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused and thrown into prison. But through it all, God was preparing Joseph for something greater. In the end, Joseph became second in command in Egypt and was able to save his family from famine. The hardships he endured were not wasted. They were part of God's divine plan, and when the time came, Joseph saw the purpose behind everything he had gone through. And what about the story of Job? Job was a man who had everything, wealth, family, and health, but in an instant, everything was taken away from him. He lost his children, his wealth, and his health. He found himself sitting in ashes, questioning why he was suffering. Yet through it all, Job never lost his faith in God. He didn't understand why he was going through the things he was going through, but he trusted that God knew what he was doing. And in the end, God restored everything that Job had lost, and he blessed him even more than before. What can we learn from these stories? We can learn that God's ways are not our ways, and his timing is not our timing. We may not always understand why things are happening the way they are, but we can trust that God knows what he is doing. He knows the when and the why. He knows what we need, and he will give it to us at the perfect moment. You might be in a season of waiting right now, and it feels like nothing is happening. You might be asking yourself, when will things change? When will I see the breakthrough? When will my prayers be answered? But I want you to know today that God knows when. He knows the exact moment when your breakthrough will come. He knows the perfect time for you to receive your healing, your promotion, your restoration. And when that moment comes, it will be better than you could have ever imagined. But while you are waiting, I encourage you to continue to trust God. Don't allow doubt to creep in. Don't let fear steal your faith. God is still working even when you can't see it. His plans are still in motion even when you don't feel it. He is preparing you for something greater. And when the time is right, he will open doors that no man can shut. As you wait for the manifestation of what God has promised you, remember this: God is never late. He is always on time. And when the time comes, you will see that the wait was worth it. God's timing is perfect, and he knows exactly when to bring his promises to pass in your life. So hold on to hope, keep trusting, and never lose sight of the fact that God knows when. He knows when your time will come. He knows when your breakthrough is on the way, and he knows when you will step into the fullness of his promises. Keep waiting, keep believing, and keep trusting in the God who knows when. Life often forces us to wait and wonder why things aren't happening as we expect. However, God's timing is always perfect. We may not understand why things are delayed, but God knows exactly when to move and when to act. Trust that he has a divine purpose behind every season of waiting, even when we cannot see the outcome. Our struggles and setbacks often serve as a preparation for the greater things God has in store for us. Just as he used Joseph's hardships to bring him into a place of power, he uses our challenges to refine and strengthen us. The win may not come on our timeline, but it will come according to God's greater plan, which is always for our good. In times of uncertainty, it's natural to want control. However, true peace comes from surrendering our plans to God and trusting in his wisdom. Our faith is tested and refined in the waiting periods. And when we let go of trying to force things to happen, we open ourselves up to God's perfect provision at the right time. Trusting in God's timing is one of the most profound and challenging aspects of faith. In a world that is constantly moving, where instant gratification is the norm and everything is expected to happen quickly, it can be incredibly difficult to understand why things are not happening when we want them to. We often find ourselves praying, longing, and waiting for something to come to pass, only to be met with silence. The waiting can feel like an eternity, and in those moments, it is easy to question whether God hears us or if he has forgotten about us. But it is in these moments of waiting that we must learn to trust in God's timing and his perfect plan for our lives. When we talk about God's timing, we are acknowledging that he is the creator of all things, that he exists outside of time and space, and that his perspective on our lives is far broader and more intricate than we could ever understand. As finite human beings, we are bound by the limitations of time, and we measure everything based on what we can see and experience in the here and now. However, God sees the entire tapestry of our lives from beginning to end, and He knows what is best for us at each and every moment. One of the biggest struggles we face is the tension between what we want and when we want it. We live in a society that encourages quick fixes and immediate rewards. We send a message and expect an instant reply. We buy something and expect it to arrive the next day. And we want answers to our prayers without delay. But God's timing does not always align with our expectations. His ways are not our ways. And His thoughts are not our thoughts. The Bible tells us that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and His ways are higher than our ways. Isaiah 55:8-9. He knows what we need and when we need it, and while we might feel like we are in a season of delay, God is actually preparing us for something greater. The challenge then is to trust in His wisdom and sovereignty. Trusting in God's timing means believing that He knows what is best for us, even when we don't understand why certain things are happening or why they haven't happened yet. It requires us to relinquish control over our own plans and surrender to the fact that God has a purpose behind every season of waiting. Whether it's waiting for a job opportunity, for healing, for a relationship, or for a breakthrough, trusting in God's timing means believing that He will make all things beautiful in their time. Ecclesiastes 3:11. There are moments in life when it feels like God is silent, when we are crying out for answers, and yet there seems to be no response. These moments can be incredibly difficult. In the silence, it is easy to doubt and question God's presence and involvement in our lives. We may begin to wonder if He is even listening or if He cares about our struggles. But this silence is often a part of the process. It is in the waiting that our faith is tested and refined. It is in the moments of uncertainty that we learn to trust God more deeply, even when we cannot see the way forward. Just because we cannot hear Him doesn't mean He is not working. God is always at work, even when we cannot perceive it. His plans are unfolding behind the scenes, and He is preparing us for what is to come. Consider the story of Abraham and Sarah in the Bible. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but for years there was no sign of this promise being fulfilled. In fact, the promise seemed impossible as Sarah was well past the age of childbearing. They were faced with the reality of their circumstances and doubt began to creep in. They tried to take matters into their own hands, with Sarah offering her maidservant to Abraham in hopes of fulfilling the promise through their own effort. But God's plan was different. He had a perfect timing that would bring His promise to fruition in a way that only He could orchestrate. At the age of 100, Abraham and Sarah finally received the child that God had promised them. And in that moment, when the promise was finally realized, they could see how perfectly God had orchestrated the entire situation. The lesson in this story is that God's timing is often different from ours. While we might be impatient, thinking that we need to act now, God is never in a hurry. He knows the right time to bring about His promises in our lives. What we must understand is that God's timing is not about us simply waiting for something to happen. It's about allowing God to prepare us for what He is about to do. There are moments in our lives when we feel that the waiting is unbearable, but what we cannot see is the work that God is doing in our hearts during this time. Trusting in His timing means understanding that the waiting is not wasted. It is a season of preparation, growth, and transformation. In those moments of waiting, we are called to remember that God is faithful. He has a track record of keeping His promises. The Bible is filled with stories of individuals who had to wait for God's promises to come to fruition. David had to wait for years to become king, even though he was anointed as a young man. The Israelites had to wait for decades in the wilderness before entering the promised land. And Jesus' disciples had to wait for the Holy Spirit to be poured out upon them after His resurrection. But in each of these instances, the waiting was not in vain. God used that time to prepare them, refine them, and align them with his will. When the time was right, they received the promise and they were ready for it. It is also important to recognize that God's timing is always aligned with his purpose. When we trust in his timing, we are surrendering to the fact that he is working all things together for our good. Romans 8:28. Even when we don't understand the circumstances, we can trust that God has a plan. He is not a distant observer. He is actively involved in our lives, working out the details in ways that we cannot fully comprehend. Trusting in God's timing means trusting that he has a greater purpose for our lives than we can see in the moment. He sees the end from the beginning, and he knows the perfect moment for things to unfold. Learning to trust in God's timing is a process. It's not something that happens overnight. It requires patience, faith, and surrender. It requires us to let go of our need for control and to trust that God will do what he has promised at the right time. There will be moments of doubt, moments of frustration, and moments of wondering why things are taking so long. But in those moments, we must remind ourselves that God is faithful and he will never fail us. His timing is always perfect and he will bring his promises to pass at just the right moment. Ultimately, trusting in God's timing is about embracing the truth that he is sovereign over all things. We may not understand why things happen when they do, but we can trust that he is working everything together for our good. When we place our faith in God's timing, we are acknowledging that he knows what is best for us and that he will always act in our best interest. Even in the waiting, even in the silence, we can trust that God is moving and his timing will never fail. God's plan is far greater than any of us can fully comprehend. As human beings, we often find ourselves caught in the small scope of our own lives, focusing on our immediate desires, struggles, and ambitions. But when we take a step back and begin to see life from God's perspective, we realize that his plan encompasses so much more. His plan is not just about us. It's about the world, the people around us, the generations to come, and the unfolding of his eternal purposes. What we sometimes fail to understand is that what we experience in our lives, whether good or bad, is all part of a much larger divine blueprint that has been in motion long before we were born and will continue long after we leave this earth. We often approach God's plan with our own limited vision, hoping that it aligns with our personal desires. We pray for specific outcomes, for immediate answers, or for things to unfold in a certain way. However, God's plan doesn't always align with our expectations. There are times when we find ourselves in circumstances that don't make sense, when things aren't going the way we hoped they would, and when we feel like we've been sidelined from the path we thought was meant for us. During these moments, it's easy to feel discouraged, frustrated, and confused, but it's important to remember that God is working all things together for good, even when we cannot see how. Consider the story of Joseph in the Bible. Joseph had dreams of greatness from a young age, but his journey to that greatness was not a straight path. Instead of stepping into his destiny with ease, Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. He endured years of hardship, yet through it all, he remained faithful to God. He didn't understand why all of these things were happening, but God's plan was at work behind the scenes. Joseph's story teaches us that even when things don't go the way we expect, God is still orchestrating events to fulfill his bigger purpose. In Joseph's case, the hardships were not random. They were part of God's larger plan to position him in a place of power and influence, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of his family and the entire nation of Egypt. Eventually, Joseph was elevated to a position of leadership, and when a famine struck, he was in the position to save his family and many others. What appeared to be a series of setbacks and injustices in Joseph's life was actually God working behind the scenes to bring about a much greater plan than Joseph could have ever imagined. Joseph himself recognized this when he said to his brothers, You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Genesis 50:20, God's plan was bigger than Joseph's understanding, and ultimately it was more beautiful than he could have ever conceived. God's plan is not only larger than our individual lives, but it is also infinitely better than any plan we could make for ourselves. We often limit ourselves by our own vision of what we think is best for us. We have a tendency to settle for less, to dream small, and to think that we know what will bring us fulfillment. But God's vision for our lives is not bound by our limitations. His vision is boundless, and it includes a future that is beyond our wildest dreams. He sees potential in us that we may not even recognize in ourselves. The beauty of God's plan is that it is not just about our happiness, it is about fulfilling the purpose for which we were created. And in doing so, we experience a deeper joy and fulfillment than we could ever achieve on our own. In the book of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul reminds us that God is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. Ephesians 3:20. This verse highlights the vastness of God's ability to work in our lives. When we think about our dreams, our hopes, and our aspirations, we often limit them to what we can envision. But God's imagination is not constrained by our limitations. His plans for us are grander, more intricate, and more fulfilling than we could ever dream on our own. We may find ourselves wondering why things aren't happening the way we planned, but in reality, God is holding a much greater vision for our future. If we can trust in his plan, we will come to understand that his timing, though sometimes different from ours, is always perfect. This truth becomes even more powerful when we consider the broader scope of God's plan. We are not living in a vacuum. The events of our lives are connected to the lives of others, and our story is part of a much larger narrative. God's plan doesn't just affect us. It has the power to influence the lives of those around us and even impact the course of history. Consider the way God used Esther in the Bible. Esther was a young Jewish woman who found herself in a position of power in the Persian Empire. When her people were threatened with destruction, it was Esther who God chose to speak up and intervene. Esther didn't understand why she had been placed in her position of influence, but she trusted that God had a purpose for her. When her uncle Mordecai encouraged her to act, he reminded her that perhaps she had been raised to the kingdom for such a time as this. Esther 4:14. Esther's obedience to God's plan not only saved her people, but also had lasting effects on the future of the Jewish people. This illustrates that God's plan is not just about individual success or personal fulfillment. It's about how he uses our lives to impact others and to bring about his kingdom on earth. When we trust in God's plan, we begin to see that our lives are part of a much larger tapestry. Every decision, every relationship, every trial we face is part of God's greater design to bring about his purposes in the world. We may not always understand why things happen the way they do, but we can trust that God is weaving it all together for a reason. Another aspect of God's plan being bigger than ours is that his plan is eternal while ours is temporary. We are often focused on the here and now, on what will bring us immediate gratification or comfort. But God's plan stretches far beyond this life. His ultimate goal is not just our temporary happiness, but our eternal transformation. He is shaping us, molding us, and refining us for eternity. What we experience in this life, both the joys and the struggles, are part of God's eternal purpose to make us more like Christ and to prepare us for the eternal life that he has promised. We might find ourselves frustrated when things don't go according to our own plans, but God's plan is eternal and his timing is perfect. We are being shaped and prepared for something greater than what we can see in the present moment. It's easy to get caught up in the frustrations of the present, but when we take a step back and view life through the lens of eternity, we can gain a deeper understanding of the purpose behind the waiting the suffering, and the delays. God's plan is always bigger, greater, and more magnificent than anything we could ever imagine. It encompasses not only our lives, but the lives of others and the unfolding of his eternal kingdom. When we trust in God's plan, we open ourselves up to a future that is far beyond what we could ever dream for ourselves. His vision is limitless, and his love for us is boundless. When we surrender our plans to God, we position ourselves to receive a life that is far more fulfilling than anything we could have planned on our own. God's plan is always bigger, and that's why we can trust that his way is the best way. Surrendering control and embracing faith is one of the most profound and transformative lessons in the journey of life. We live in a world that constantly pressures us to take control, to have a plan, and to be the master of our own fate. Society praises those who have everything figured out, who maintain a sense of order and control over every aspect of their lives. However, for many of us, no matter how hard we try, life does not always go as planned. The path is filled with unexpected twists, challenges, and moments of uncertainty that reveal the limits of our control. This is where the power of surrendering control and embracing faith comes in, acknowledging that while we may not be able to control everything, we can trust in a higher power who is always in control. To surrender control means to let go of the need to manage every detail of our lives. It means accepting that we are not in charge of everything and there are forces beyond our comprehension at work in the world. Our natural inclination is to hold on tightly to what we think we can control. Our careers, our finances, our relationships, our health. We plan, we organize, and we strive to anticipate every possible outcome. But the reality is, we can't control everything, and when things go awry, it often leads to stress, anxiety, and a sense of powerlessness. The act of surrender doesn't mean giving up or being passive. Instead, it is an active choice to release our grip on the things that we cannot control and trust that there is a greater purpose unfolding. Surrender is the recognition that we are not the ultimate authority in our lives, and that's okay. This does not diminish our responsibility or our ability to take action. It simply reminds us that there are times when the best thing we can do is release our need for control and place our trust in something bigger than ourselves. This act of letting go can be incredibly difficult, especially when we are faced with situations that feel overwhelming or out of our hands. The human tendency is to hold on tighter when we feel out of control, to try and fix things, to manipulate circumstances in our favor. But true surrender comes from a place of faith. It's about acknowledging that while we may not know the future or understand the present moment, we trust that the one who holds the universe is working on our behalf. Surrendering control means choosing faith over fear, peace over anxiety, and trust over doubt. Faith is not simply a passive belief that everything will work out, but an active trust in God's wisdom, goodness, and sovereignty. It is a confident assurance that no matter what happens, God is in control, and he is working all things together for good. Faith allows us to step into the unknown with the assurance that we are not alone, that we are guided and protected by a loving and faithful Creator. Faith reminds us that we do not have to figure it all out, that we do not have to have all the answers, and that it is okay to rest in the certainty that God has a plan that is far greater than anything we can imagine. Consider the example of Abraham. God called Abraham to leave his home, his family, and everything he knew to follow a path that was completely unknown. Abraham didn't have a map or a detailed plan of the journey ahead. All he had was God's promise, and yet he chose to surrender his will and embrace faith. He trusted that God would provide, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain and the promise seemed impossible. His faith wasn't perfect, but it was enough to take the first step into the unknown. And through his surrender, God was able to fulfill a promise that blessed not only Abraham, but the entire world. Abraham's story teaches us that faith is not about knowing exactly what will happen next. It is about trusting that God knows what is best and that his plans are always better than our own. When we surrender control, we allow God to move in our lives in ways that we could never anticipate. We allow him to work in us, through us, and for us in ways that align with his purpose for our lives. Surrender doesn't mean sitting idly by and doing nothing. It means acting with faith, making decisions, and moving forward, but always with the understanding that God is the one who ultimately holds the reins. The process of surrendering control and embracing faith is often not immediate. It's a journey that requires time, reflection, and a willingness to let go of our need for certainty. At times, we may find ourselves wavering between holding on and letting go. When we face uncertainty, it can be tempting to take matters into our own hands, to try to control the outcome. But when we choose faith, we are choosing to trust in the unseen, to believe that God is working behind the scenes, even when we cannot see the full picture. Faith calls us to rest in the belief that God is good, that he is faithful, and that he will never leave us or forsake us. It is easy to talk about faith and surrender when things are going well, when everything seems to be in order. But what about when the storms of life come? What about when the unexpected happens, when we receive bad news, or when everything we've worked for seems to be slipping away? This is where the depth of our faith is tested. In these moments, surrendering control may feel like the hardest thing to do. We may question why things are happening the way they are and struggle to make sense of our circumstances. Yet it is in these very moments that surrendering control becomes most important. It is in the storms that we are reminded that we do not have to face them alone. Embracing faith in the midst of uncertainty is an act of trust. And it is often in these moments that our faith grows deeper and stronger. Jesus offers us a beautiful example of surrender when he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane before his crucifixion. He knew the suffering that awaited him, and he prayed, asking God to take the cup of suffering away from him if possible. Yet, he surrendered his own will, saying, "Not my will, but yours be done." Luke 22:42. Jesus exemplified the ultimate act of surrender, not because he wanted to suffer, but because he trusted that God's plan, though painful in the moment, was for a greater purpose. His surrender brought about the redemption of the world, and through his faith, we are given the opportunity to experience grace, forgiveness, and salvation. In our own lives, surrendering control and embracing faith is not a one-time decision, it is a daily choice. Each day we are presented with the opportunity to surrender our plans, our desires, and our fears to God. It's about choosing to trust him with our present and our future, to let go of the need for control, and to rest in the assurance that he is working everything together for our good. Surrender doesn't mean passivity or resignation. It means actively choosing to trust in God's goodness, wisdom, and timing. When we embrace faith and surrender control, we open ourselves up to experiencing life in a deeper, more meaningful way. We are freed from the burden of trying to control every outcome, and we begin to experience peace, joy, and confidence in God's ability to guide us through every circumstance. It is in the surrender that we find true freedom, the freedom to trust, to rest, and to move forward with faith that God is in control, even when we cannot see the way ahead. In the end, surrendering control and embracing faith allows us to live in alignment with God's will, trusting that his plan is far greater than anything we could ever imagine.